This session, we're going to be taking you through some of the new products that we've been talking a lot about. In particular, Lumina Select. I know I did go through this at quite a high level on Monday when we talked about innovation and how Lumina is hopefully innovating, particularly in the field of recruitment. But I wanted to go a little bit deeper on this today. I know a lot of you have many questions on the product, and it is very new. So we actually only launched this version of Lumina Select last Friday, so it is very, very much, very fresh. So I guess the core objectives of this session is to look at what Lumina Select is actually measuring, and also the how, so a bit on the science behind it as well, but I'll do my best to keep it really not too data focused, but there are some interesting statistics that obviously sit behind this as well. And then Stuart will be supporting me as well as we go through this, and we will be looking at the new Lumina team functionality too. So a bit of a blend. So it was great to see Julia talking about the model that we worked on, which was a bespoke, customized competency model. But Lumina Select uses our own 16 competencies that have sort of emerged from Lumina Leader. You'll see a bit of an influence of, obviously the 4 colors are in there. But Julia also referenced a product called Lumina Professional, which is actually a competency model that we use to do a lot of our research, including the research that went into Stuart's PhD, where we got a lot of you to get 360 feedback on yourselves. And the reason why we did that is we wanted to come up with a comprehensive set of competencies that we felt reflected the complexities of many different work environments, but also for individuals who were not necessarily in leadership positions, for example, which is obviously more of the tone of Lumina Leader. So just to go through the model, so you can all familiarize yourself with it. I know some of you are familiar with Lumina Select 16 competencies, but for others, these will be new. So our yellow competencies, so we've got adapting to change, agile learning, conceptualizing strategies, and fostering creativity. So what we would say is this collection of competencies reflect performing through pioneering. So being able to spot opportunities and apply your creativity. Obviously, you can see the qualities that would align to it are naturally those that sit in big picture thinking. But as we go through, we will highlight how actually a lot of the competencies and what Rainer was just talking into earlier, it's a blend of different qualities that often go across the model. So it's a smoothie approach. So it's not just a pure big picture thinking set of competencies. Next, we've got our blue ones, so looking at the opposite side of the spectrum. So gathering and analyzing information, ensuring accountability, so making sure things are getting done, planning and organizing, and also pursuing and achieving goals, which link nicely to, of course, our blue quadrant in the Lumina Spark model. And this is what we call performing through delivery. Then we got our red competencies, so working under pressure, engaging and energizing, providing direction, and purposeful argumentation, linking nicely to a lot of the red qualities, but also, as you can see, a bit of discipline-driven and some other qualities coming in there too. And this is what we call our performing through influence set of competencies. And then lastly, what have we got in the green area, the green corner? So it's being interpersonally astute, working together, coaching and developing others, and also supporting others. So hopefully, I'll just to finalize on that, this is what we're calling performing through people. So hopefully quite a nice holistic model that we would like to think covers a lot of the requirements of a lot of jobs, which is why this is very relevant for selection purposes. So this is our new version of Lumina Select. As I said, this is the product that has literally just gone live last Friday. Some of you may have worked with a version very similar to this, but yeah, this is the one-page PDF that we are working with, and it is live now. So if any of you want to get this activated in your accounts and start using it, it's ready to go. So do get in touch. So you can see our nice 16 competencies running down here on the left-hand side. And we've also got a 1 to 5 score. And as you can see, it's based on a fit a fitness score between 1 to 5. And we've also got our qualities running down on the right. These are actually a blend of the underlying and everyday persona. And Rainer was mentioning it earlier, how we want to focus on the affective side of personality, but also we are curious to see how the overextended do affect things like competency potential, and I'll say a little bit more on how we're incorporating that into Lumina Select as well. So this is a blend of underlying and everyday, and of course we've got splash and some interesting narrative on the candidate. So one thing we've also introduced, again, literally last Friday, is a special norm if you are going to use Lumina Select. Well, we're giving you the option to decide whether you want to use an applicant norm. So that's based on individuals who have taken Spark in a high-stake environment, such as, in most cases, a recruitment setting. Versus people who have taken Spark in a developmental context where the pressure hasn't been so high, they don't feel like they need to put their best face forward, for example. So you can probably realize why we do this. In a high-stakes situation, there can be more of a tendency to maybe tune up some of our characteristics to come across maybe a little bit more favorable. Obviously, Spark is very neutral. We talked about evaluative bias earlier on, so the questions are very, very neutral. However, there are some trends we do find in terms of the differences between people who are applying in a, just for not applying for a job versus just doing Spark for developmental purposes. So here's an example, actually. So this is a Spark portrait, 24 qualities based on exactly the same set of scores, but compared to a standard norm. And here we can see the 24 qualities. But what happens when we actually compare it to a high-stake norm? So you'll see that some qualities in particular are affected. And it might be no surprise to see that it's actually quite a lot of discipline-driven. So you can see that somebody who scored, let's see if we look at reliable, for example, a 38 percentile score in a normal norm has now shot down to 18%. And the reason why that's happening is because more people in an applicant or high-stakes situation are claiming reliable, which is probably not a surprise. We're also seeing a similar trend for practical, also logical and purposeful. So we've only highlighted ones here that we feel have the biggest jump, so between 15 to 20% shift in the percentile score. People also want to be considered to be very enthusiastic, of course, which is what demonstrative reflects, so that tends to go down as well, and also conceptual and collaborative. So they tend to be, I guess, the most socially desirable traits that we find in the Lumina Spark model. So you will notice that, well, you might probably haven't noticed because it's so new, we have a new setting in the project settings where you can actually decide whether you want to use a standard norm or whether you want to use the high-stake norm. So you can still generate a select in the developmental norm, the standard norm as we're calling it, but if you are doing a recruitment, if you're managing a recruitment situation, we would recommend you do select the high-stake norm. That does mean that in this project, if you generate a Spark after that point in time, the Spark scores will also be compared against this applicant norm. So there'll be a consistency between the select scores and the Spark scores. So if you do get to a situation where somebody has come on board and they do want to use their Spark for developmental purposes, you're going to be giving them some onboarding or some coaching. That does mean we would recommend that they take the Spark again because it is a different context. And we do sort of experience this, we see people who've got their Spark reports, but it was they got them through doing a recruitment or applying for a job. And on reflection, I think if they were to do it completely afresh in a completely neutral, non-high-stakes situation, you might see some differences. So always do give the opportunity. In fact, it's very much something we would recommend for them to do it again. Yeah, so just to highlight that point. Okay, so what do we feel the key features of Lumina Select are? So, well, it's colorful and highly intuitive. So I know, Julia, you mentioned simplicity, and that is definitely something we want to have in Lumina Select. So the colors keep it really relevant for those who are familiar with Spark, making that transition between recruitment and development much simpler. So humanistic approach, so valuing all personality traits at both ends. So Stuart has obviously done a huge amount of work on this through his PhD, looking at evaluative bias. And obviously Lumina always wants to do something a bit different. And we're hoping that through Lumina Select, we are trying to reduce the evaluative bias that we can also see in recruitment situations as well, through using the Spark questionnaire as its foundation. So going a bit deeper, so Rainer alluded to the fact that the dark side is a very interesting area that people are curious to look at in recruitment settings and also in the competency models. However, I can't really think of many examples of any competency potential tools that actually do look at the dark side. Lumina, of course, looks at the overextended, so I'm going to share with you how we are incorporating that into Lumina Select. And lastly, an interactive and engaging platform, which is coming soon, which I'm going to be demoing for you. I did do this on Monday, but I appreciate there's some new faces in the room who won't have seen this new platform. So on that note, I'm just going to jump over to a live demo, which is always good. Just going back to, I know some of you have seen this before, so we have built a digital version of Lumina Select in our new applicant tracking system. The reason why we wanted to digitalize it is because we know, obviously, having a one-page PDF is great, but it is static, and we want to give people the opportunity to really have that flexibility to customize it to their needs, and really just to bring it to life. And make it quite simple for people to interpret quite a lot of information. So this is the applicant tracking system, which is where you have all your roles or positions that are currently open, and these are essentially your projects. So it's just a different way of displaying all your projects that are live. So I'm just going to go into a sample project, and here you can see our recruitment pipeline again. So we've got our 13 applicants. One's been listed as a shortlist, and I'll show you how you actually manage this pipeline. So the Lumina Select scores will all sit in what we're calling a merit list, and this is where you can review all your candidates and do interesting things like, as I said, just change them around and move them around the pipeline. So for example, I am currently in a shortlist. I'm going to move that to higher. There we go. And now you can see I have just been moved into higher, which is not biased at all. But the main thing I want to show you is actually the scores, which is really the juice of it all. So we've got a digital representation of the same scores that we see in the PDF version. So you can see them here. So this will also still show you the 1 to 5 scores. We've also got the 24 qualities listed here as well for easy reference. And the key thing here is also being able to toggle between the 3 lenses that we're calling them, which is, in a way, what I wanted to focus on a bit more now, which is how Lumina is bringing in the overextended into competency assessment. But the real value add here is what we're calling the Lumina Select Explainer. And this is really the digitization of the Lumina Select profile with some really nice additional benefits, such as being able to do your job profiling. And just for those of you who are new to the room, I'll just demo this for you. So the ability to be able to select the competencies that you're particularly interested in evaluating the candidate against, and also being able to make use of some of the data that we've actually already done on this. So looking at the kind of profiles that you might see across different roles. So Julia, here's the legal one, which I'm sure will resonate with you. So when we've looked at the competencies, they come out on top on Blue, red, no surprise there. So a lot of the red competencies peppered with things like pursuing and achieving goals and also ensuring accountability. These are not things that you have to, completely abide by if you wanted to come up with different set of competencies, even for those types of roles. That's completely your prerogative, obviously working with your stakeholders and making those decisions. But it just gives you a bit of a helping hand to focus your evaluation. So jumping into our portrait walkthrough, which is the digital version of essentially what you see in the same PDF, but in a way that makes it much more interactive. So we've got our splash, for example, that we can just make bigger. And also we've got our 24 qualities and 1 to 5 scores. But I wanted to really hone in on these 3 lenses that I mentioned, because this is quite distinct to how a lot of other people do things. So the effective scores, so what are we actually measuring there? So you can see this is actually my profile. I've got a bit of a blend of scores, so I'm coming out 2s on some things, 5s on some other things. So what does this actually say? What does this mean? Well, what we're assessing is competency potential. So this is what Rainer alluded to earlier on. We are using personality as the engine that sits behind this. So we're not measuring performance, actual performance. Of course, that would be through other measures, such as things like 360s or other types of workplace assessments. What we can do, though, is assess how well somebody might like or enjoy those types of behaviors and how energized they will be by those behaviors. So it's not necessarily saying that because I have got a 5 on gathering and analyzing information, I'd be very good at it, necessarily. However, it is suggesting that my natural preferences and tendencies are aligned to those kind of behaviors. Much like the ones where I'm quite low on, so fostering creativity. Those who know me, I've got a very low big picture thinking. So it's suggesting that if you put Julie in a situation where she'd have to come up with a lot of creative ideas on the fly, that probably wouldn't be so engaging for me. So it's about telling you what the individual is likely to enjoy and have preferences for. So what about blockers? So blockers are based on qualities that negatively have predicted performance on these competencies. So just to give you an example, I've got a very high blocked potential score on fostering creativity. And when we look at the qualities that actually drive that, you can see why. So I'm pretty narrow-sighted. I get lost in the details. I'm change resistant. I'm detached and aloof. And well, I don't have too much seeks conflict, but I have a lot of the other things that unfortunately don't go so hand in hand with being able to foster creativity a lot of the time. So how do we interpret somebody who might have some high blocker scores? Well, it's possible that actually somebody could have a high strength score, they have high competency potential, and they might also show a blocker. So in that scenario, it might just be suggesting that while they do have strong potential, there might be some areas for development that still exist within their personality that, if they worked on, could unlock some more potential in that area. Or if they're very low on the competency potential and very high on the blocked potential, that's probably suggesting that that person just will not have much energy for that competency really at all.
If I could chip in there, Julie, because this is quite a nice example. In the interview, if we were interviewing Julie, and we were needing her to be creative in the role, we could explore her change resistance, how she gets lost in the details, because she may actually have really good strategies for dealing with it. Yeah. So just because it's not her psychological preference, you may well be able to demonstrate, in fact, knowing you and how we work creatively together, Julie does have good strategies for working on that, and that would come out of the interview process. Make sense?
Yeah, really good point. And also worth noting, okay, so I might have a block potential. Is it going to be hugely relevant for the job that I'm actually applying for? So doing a little exercise before where we did the job profiler, so looking at these starred areas. So these are going to be the ones that these scores are going to be most relevant for. So it's worth bearing that in mind that someone might have a very high blocked potential on a competency, but if it's not relevant to the role, is it really an issue at all? So our other lens that also draws on the overextended qualities is what we're calling the overextended use. So if we look at ones where I might have high overextension, so gathering and analysing information, I've got a very high overextended use. And when we look at it, it's because I'm lost in the details, serious and withdrawn, which we know are qualities that are basically reflecting how I can overplay that. So again, it might be driven from the fact that I have a very high strength in that area, and therefore it's, well, maybe we have to look at the good with the bad. But it can also be driven potentially from an overcompensation. So if you maybe don't have a high natural tendency to do this, but you have a very high overextended use, again, that's something you might want to explore about why that is in the interview process.
So we take this one as an example here. Julie's really good at gathering and analysing information. It's core to her role. So what might her overextension look like? It might look like just doing it in the wrong context. There's a time to analyse and gather data, and it could be that we need a team meeting, or we're going into some brainstorm, and you sort of sticking that comfort zone. Yeah. And again, that would be something to discuss, in the interview process. Does that actually happen? Are you aware when it might happen? Have you got strategies for handling it?
Yeah, and I think that's exactly right. It's about self-awareness of these potential limitations or potential overextended use. The fact that somebody has claimed this in a high-stakes situation is also something to be valued. Obviously, they're aware of it and they're happy to disclose it. You don't want to get under the assumption that because everyone is a 1 on overextended use or block potential, they are these perfect individuals. That's also something you might want to question as well. So it's good, when you're seeing people disclose and be open and honest, and using that for, to really delve into that deeper in the interview process as well. So, and again, just for the benefit of those of you who didn't see the final bit of this, which is the interview guide. So this is where you can also customize your interview questions and generate an interview guide that's customized to the needs. So, for example, just the competencies that you're particularly interested in, and you're able to print a lovely interview guide that you can take in. But we also give you the option to add your own questions as well. And I know this is a repeat for some of you, but repetition is always good. And also, so if you're new to the room today. And this just gives you a little more insight into what I was just discussing, so sort of explaining the difference between what a high effective score is, what a high blocker score is, and how you might want to handle that in an interview situation. So here we can see our competency scores, our default questions, which, as I mentioned, you can customize them, and also some place to write notes and give a score. So just jumping back to the slides. Yeah, so hopefully that's given you a bit of an insight into how the overextended in particular is being weaved into Lumina Select, and how hopefully that can be a really good advantage in making more effective recruitment decisions. Stu, do you want to do a bit on job profile?
Sure. So in terms of, how do you decide what are the competencies to include when you look at a role? So Julie shared, she clicked on legal, it looked in our database and showed you the typical competencies of people in the legal profession. But there are other things you can do to go further, and one is to gather a real sample of people in the organisation that do a role, and actually have a look, A, at their Lumina Spark scores, and B, have a look at their performance and see if there's any difference between the high performers, lower performers, and so on. And there's a huge amount you can do here, dependent on the amount of resource and time the client wants to put into it. So I'm just going to show you one way of using Lumina Team to support that process. I'm going to show you some project managers. So I want you to have a guess, which of the 8 aspects do you think would be highest for a group of project managers. These are project managers, the group we're about to look at. They work internationally, coordinating site engineers, sending them to jobs to reconfigure networks and computers or when things have gone wrong, assigning them and then checking the job's done and so on. Which of the qualities do you think you would need to be high for the person that's managing that process? I hear discipline-driven, outcome focus. Are there any that are not so important? Would any get in the way? Would any of the 8 aspects potentially be unhelpful? Introverted, inspiration-driven. Okay, so we're going to have a look at some real data here. If we can. Okay.
Spot on.
Yeah. So this is actually a group of project managers. As it happens, out of interest, they're all in Madagascar. So this is an organisation we work with that moved all their project managers or set up an office in Madagascar to do it globally. And let's just have a little play. So I'm going to click on the plus button here, and we'll have a look at where are they underlying. So actually, they're a little bit more sensible and down to earth, and I have been over there and seen them in this office, and their natural state is to be pretty grounded and sensible real-world people. If we have a look at their everyday, they do split a little bit more, go a bit more up towards the people-focused as well. It's quite a friendly office. And if we have a look at what they do under pressure, this is pretty much when their jobs are going wrong, and they need to get them back on track. Discipline-driven, stick to it, follow the process, with a bit of extroverted energy sometimes to, turn up the volume when they're communicating with people to get things back on track. So what you can do here in terms of Lumina Select, this is really helpful data. So these are the people in the role. Now that doesn't mean that they're all brilliant. So it is useful to now say, let's gather data on who's doing the job well. And I've given you a more extreme case here in this role, but we can drill into the qualities underneath, underlying everyday and overextended, and see which qualities are actually supporting strong performance or weak performance. And in some instances, it does turn out occasionally that an overextended quality can actually help with performance. So there was one organisation we worked with where they were consultants in a huge organisation, and it turned out that overextended takes charge correlated positively with performance. And when we investigated that, there was so much inertia in the organisation, unless you were like so unbelievably full on and pushed really, really hard, you just couldn't get anything done. So in that, so it varies from context to context. So I'm going to give you one other example. So I'm going to give you a group of psychologists from the Association for Business Psychology. Where do you think they would be? I'm going to show you quite a big group here. Where do you think psychologists at a psychology conference would be? It's the Association for Business Psychology, so I should say that probably 60% are psychologists, maybe 40% are people in business that are very interested in psychology, but may not be actually psychologists. Where do you think they'd be? You think people-focused? Yeah. You think introverted, down to earth? Big picture thinking. I think I'm hearing everything. Well, let's have a look. Yeah. So we'll go here. And the ABP.
Just to let you know, myself and Nikita are both psychologists, so yeah, you can
just to
probably
show
see
you can
the
be
variety that exists there.
And there you have it. Yeah. So that was a group of people attending a psychology conference, and the introversion and the down to earth were relatively lower, and seemed to be more on the right hand side. Who knows? It could have been something about this particular conference that attracted them. It could be the ones that are more introverted didn't go to the conference. They're at home looking it up on a forum on the internet or watching the videos afterwards. I don't know. But again, we can drill in here and we can say, well, what happens to this esteemed group of psychologists underlying? They're maybe less people-focused, and where do they go every day? So if we look at the everyday, quite a big spread actually around all 8. Yeah. Where do you think they go under pressure? What do you reckon? What do you reckon they do under pressure? We'll take a peep. Yeah. And you can see the main circle, which is the sort of most common approach, the collective, which takes into account people's sort of second, third, and fourth aspects would be around discipline-driven. But it's a little bit in there indicating there is a draw from the top half as well. So any questions on how you might use this data in the context of selection to look at a community of people, analyze it, and then find out which ones are the strong performers and correlate it? Does it make sense? Yeah. Steve?
I've got one question, which is, often there's one person that pushes everybody into overextension.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So I do a lot of culture change work, and often there's one or two very senior people that push everybody into overextension.
Mm-hmm.
So my concern, I guess, is that you could be looking at people that are in places they don't want to be because someone with a long-handled screwdriver has started fiddling with no knowledge of what they're doing. And I guess my observation is that in most of the organisations I'm in, if I get the top 2 or 3 people behaving okay, everybody else is pretty good people. And I guess the thing that I think about at the moment is we're living in a massive global problem. You know, the bankers generated for us, every single one of us in this room, £30,000 worth of debt each. That's what it looks like for the UK. And all of them were exactly the same people. They looked the same. And if you're selecting and you've got criteria that, you know, a banker looks like this, you know, it's like this, you know, one of the arguments against AI, there's no such thing as AI if you basically say, what should a High Court judge look like? It's like, well, somebody that's been to Cambridge and a posh school and is a middle-aged bloke. Yeah. So I guess how do you deal with that tipping point, significant key players?
So, I mean, there's no ultimate answer, but a few thoughts. I mean, on the one hand, you need a bigger sample to make sure you're not subject to the vagrancies of just 1 or 2 individuals triggering people. I guess you probably into a broader intervention, if you do encounter a situation, and I know you do, where a couple of people, senior people, are triggering other people, that's really where the effort for the intervention needs to go there, rather than trying to solve whatever issues are through a general selection solution. You know, so that's why for Lumina we want to have a broad range of tools, and we want all of us to be good OD consultants so that we can be nimble around addressing the real issue. Yeah. So thank you. Good question. Yeah. Julie?
I was just going to say, let's jump back to the slides. So just to go into a little bit more of the actual science behind those scores. So obviously, these 1 to 5 scores, there's a lot of research that's actually sitting behind them. But I just wanted to give you a bit more insight into how they're actually generated. Oh. That's a big slide. Okay, so just to show you.
One more. Go one more.
Go one more. Oh, there we go. That makes it a little bit easier. So these are the 5 most predictive qualities that drive the competencies that we see in the yellow or pioneering space. So it's probably no surprise to see quite a lot of big picture thinking being reflected there. But as I mentioned, it's usually a smoothie. So what we're seeing is also a bit of inspiration driven, particularly in being agile in your learning approach. So being flexible is highly relevant there. And also a bit of extroversion blended in there or weaved in there too. So for example, fostering creativity. So obviously it's great to have lots of good ideas, but also you have to be able to engage people in them and to generate energy behind them as well. So which is why things like takes charge is taking a central role in that prediction equation as well. For the red, unsurprisingly, we're seeing a lot of red, but we're also seeing that blended with discipline-driven and also extroversion. So in a way, that right-hand side, bottom quadrant of the mandala. For the blue competencies, we're seeing a nice smoothie again of a lot of discipline-driven, but also down-to-earth and also introversion. And this is also where Lumina is quite different in its approach, in that we actually measure introversion. And having done a lot of the research looking at the predictive validity of introversion to a lot of competencies, actually introversion is highly predictive of competencies, particularly around things like, you know, planning and organizing or gathering and analyzing. We're running out of time.
which is a practical example of how evaluative bias, reducing it and understanding it, is not just useful when we're being developed, it's also useful in a selection context, because here are some introverted qualities that are not normally measured so positively, and some down to earth, which is the opposite of big picture thinking or openness, evidence-based and so on. If you don't measure it constructively, it won't feature in your equation. So that's a huge positive from our approach.
And what about green competencies? Well, it's not just about being people-focused. So if we look at coaching developing, as I know many of you are coaches and facilitators in the room, it is being collaborative, but actually it's a lot of being energetic and having a lot of energy for interacting with other people. So here we're seeing the combination of people-focused and extroversion in action.
And one thing to add here, if we take the example of Don, you know, high on people-focused, collaborative and so on. In terms of your working together, you're going to score really well here because you've got the collaboration, the empathy. But look, in comes your 99% reliable. So it's not just about being a nice guy, it's about doing it on time as well, which you do. So we're getting some interesting smoothie blends to build up to these competencies.
Just to say again, as I mentioned, evaluative bias. So the fact that we look at both ends actually makes for really great predictive validity in the tool that is actually not open to many tools who only look at one end of the spectrum. So a good example is being interpersonally astute. And what we can see here is that both being sociable and intimate drive effective performance on that competency. So even though they are on opposite sides of the spectrum, they are working together positively in that space, which is really, really exciting to see, because if we had not measured these two things separately, we would not capture that nuance. Similarly as well, for gathering and analysing information, being both highly conceptual but also very evidence-based, and the combination of those makes for somebody who's particularly good at doing evaluation and analysis. And also just to highlight, as I mentioned, the value of introversion. We typically don't measure introversion, and here we're seeing the positive predictive influence of that, rather than just saying, oh, if they don't have extroversion, we're actually looking at the value it can bring to these types of competencies. Just to say a bit on the weighting, so I showed you all the qualities that drive the effective qualities there. However, they're not all equally reflected or equally represented in those equations. So I'll give you an example. Providing direction, the qualities that influence it are things like takes charge, tough, purposeful, structured, and reliable. However, takes charge takes the central role in that equation. Which makes sense. You need to feel energized by taking charge if we want to give you a good score in providing direction. The other qualities, though, you can consider them as like boosters. So while they're not sort of the driving force, if you want to be good at providing direction, what our data says is not only do you have the energy for taking the lead in situations, but you're good at giving structured goals and objectives, and you are also reliable yourself. So that is what makes a most effective leader in our data. And you can see blockers are similar. You know, we can see the different weightings that we give to the relative qualities. And in some instances, there's maybe one or two central qualities, and the rest are given quite a more insignificant weighting, whereas in other competencies, a lot of the things are blended sort of almost mutually. So they're weighted quite evenly. Just to give you an idea of the actual predictive validity of these competencies, so here are our validities. So you can see that we are correlating on average between personality predictions and performance at 0.25. So very similar to what Rainer was showing earlier today, although you can see we've got some really, really high validities, particularly in some areas, such as planning and organising, 0.39. For the blockers, so this is predicting if you have overextended qualities, how likely you're to not receive good feedback on competencies. Again, really strong validities, even minus 0.41, but on average it's minus 0.29. And what I was really fascinated with is actually saying that blockers are actually slightly more predictive of performance than the effective scores. And most tools don't actually give any emphasis on dark side or derailers qualities in the selection process.
And just one comment on this. If you do end up presenting this to clients and so on, and they're using other instruments, it's worth getting in touch with Julie and myself to make sure we're comparing apples with apples and not apples with pears when compared with other instruments. So, for example, this is just a straight sort of correlation here. Some competitors make an adjustment for reliability, which can make the numbers be higher. So if you're being compared with a competitor and that's happening, let us know and we'll make the same adjustment so it's apples and apples in terms of validity and not apples and pears. Make sense? Yep.
And just to put it in context, so is a correlation of 0.2, 0.3, is that good? Well, it's interesting when you look at the research. So this is some results from a large meta-analysis, which basically looks at a combination of studies and gives you the overall predictive validity. And you can see that looking at lots of studies, actually personality doesn't fare too well. The best correlation you see is between conscientiousness and overall job performance, whereas the other qualities aren't giving so much of a impact. However, when you actually do very point-to-point type correlations, so when you define the qualities that you think will predict a competency and actually measure that competencies, the validities, of course, do shoot up, similar to what Rainer was showing before.
So that one there, this is a 93 seminal text. Try to do everything at a very high level, Big Five and performance, and you can see these correlations. Apart from conscientious, they're not fantastic. But it is the breaking it down into specific competencies with specific spark qualities. That's when we get the juice. That's when we get a better predictive engine, which I think, thanks to Rainer, he's been working on this for 30 years, banging the drum. So, yeah.
And just to, if you want to kind of actually contextualize this, so what does these correlations mean in terms of the impact they have on performance? So as I mentioned at the beginning, we're only measuring personality. We can only say how much potential somebody might have to demonstrate effective performance. So what these validities show is that the Lumina Select the personality measured through Lumina Select can account for up to 15% of the variance in job performance. So obviously there's a huge amount of other things that need to be accounted for, and obviously this is where skills, experience, knowledge, all of those very, 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 very important things come into play. And also just to really make the point that you don't want to overplay the impact that personality has on job performance. It is only one small measure as part of a much bigger puzzle, but it is very, very useful and interesting. And 15% is still very, very, very very helpful and gives a lot of incremental validity to the recruitment process. And lastly, just to give you again some context of correlation and how good they are. So this is some interesting research where they looked at the correlation of different drugs and different patterns of different information and how they actually related to real-world outcomes. So, for example, height and weight in US adults was 0.44, which is actually quite small. I would have thought the correlation would be quite high. But it is funny to note that when we actually look at it, the correlation between somebody's personality and whether they're good at planning and organizing is pretty much the same as Viagra. So if anyone asks you how predictive is personality and performance, you could say, well, it's about as good as Viagra, which ain't too bad. So just a last little note, which is just to say for those of you who missed it, if you are curious about using the new digital version of Lumina Select, we are looking for trialing partners, and that is those of you who want to be early adopters, which Julia was mentioning earlier on. And basically that just means you will be happy to go through some training, so you're comfortable using it, and basically give some nice feedback to us and appreciate that changes will be made, because this is a beta version. But we want you to be able to go out and trial it and test it with your clients, and then get back to us over the next coming months. So if you are keen to get involved and want to be a trialing partner, just get in touch with my email. And yeah, thanks.